And to start, I will just ask them today, several companies aim to implement a non-emphatic behavior in their interactive AI systems or in conversational agents. What does it mean? Is it realistic? I give you the floor.
Thank you, Isabelle. Well, let's start out by defining empathy, because I think there's a considerable amount of misunderstanding about what empathy is. The classic definition of empathy is that it is to understand the feelings and perspective of another. Some definitions add that empathy also means to feel the feelings of another, but that's been quite contentious, as many wish to avoid that aspect of things because it's not necessarily good for oneself or for the other to feel emotions. So let's stick with that definition of empathy, meaning understanding the emotions of another, the feelings of another.
Raja?
So, yes, I agree, of course, with this definition by Justine. And the question immediately raises, to answer the question that was addressed by Isabelle, is, can machines have empathy? Empathy is defined amongst people and animals sometimes, but machines. And that's the point. Machines or computer programs or AI systems or conversational agents are based on programs, algorithm, even if there is learning behind this sometimes, but they don't feel, they don't understand emotion because they don't live emotion. And emotion is not a computation, it's not just a set of values. So therefore, we shouldn't pretend that they feel and that they are empathic. We use a term which is applicable to human beings for machines, and this is not correct, actually. There's an issue with the wording itself. So saying that we are going to build machines that feel or that have empathy is wrong. It's an approximation. And we can use it in everyday's speech among specialists eventually, but not really to convey that to the public that it is true.
Yeah, I agree with you, Raja. I think it's an important point. I don't believe either that machines can feel. I don't believe that in the future they will feel. And even if one day we were to attempt to embed some sense of feeling in a machine, really all it would be is signal processing. Machines don't feel emotion, they don't feel empathy. And yet many companies have announced that they're adding empathy to their conversational agents, to their robots, to their online systems. What does that mean? I think many of them are confused about what empathy means and whether they can add it, but many also, one can hope, are taking the notion that machines can be interlocutors, that they can listen. And if empathy is to feel the emotions of another, to understand the emotions of another, machines can't do that, but they can demonstrate that they can listen. And sometimes better than humans, they have endless time. They can listen forever. And in that sense, I think, and perhaps you disagree, Raja, that machines can serve an important role as interlocutors to help us understand our own emotions, to help us listen to ourselves.
Well, yes, you're right. We are complex beings, but listening is not understanding, actually, because you can listen, you can pretend you're listening actually to someone, but actually maybe you don't care. Take, for example, in the life before the COVID, I used to travel often, and you sit in planes or in airport lobbies and with perfect strangers, and you start discussing and saying things about you you would never say to anyone else, actually, which who are closer. And they pretend that they understand or feel empathy most of the time, but actually they don't care. Well, sometimes they care, and it's exceptional. So listening is not really indeed understanding, but at the same time, the fact that you express yourself, that you say things that you feel, this is actually what's happening. So yes, they are not, in my opinion, completely interlocutors, because it's the inter. It's just that it's something in this case to which you can speak, and it gives you this ability to express yourself. You are not necessarily unaware that it's a machine, but in this context, it's helpful. I agree, but
Yeah.
you have to be transparent about it.
Right, and I think that's where the important point comes up. So I agree with you that what's called the stranger in the train phenomenon is more important for the person talking than it is for the person listening. We do tend to share some deep feelings with people that we don't know. And research has shown, for example, that in survey interviews, people may be more willing to be honest and forthcoming with a conversational agent conducting a survey interview than with a real human. And there are important uses for that. The problem arises if the designers of these systems are not transparent about what the limits of the system are. That is, do the designers build into these systems ways of representing to people that they are like people? No. In the work that I've done, we make it very clear that what a person is speaking with is a computer, a conversational agent who can listen, but who cannot feel. And I think that's where this notion of transparency comes in. And transparency is a very important, an important pillar of ethical work in AI.
So do you think we need some regulation?
Well, maybe I can take this one just for the start. Indeed, actually, transparency of AI systems is something really important. It's one of the requirements that the high-level expert group with the European Commission put forward. Transparency means that you know that you are talking to a machine in this case. It has other dimensions I will not address now for the sake of time. And we know that the European Commission is now preparing a legislation. It's an ongoing work, and it's going to be announced probably in the first quarter of 2021. So transparency might come in to legislation. I don't know how much strong legislation this is going to be, how much it's going to be just about some good practice, of course, in this case. But indeed, the issue of transparency is important, and it is actually already in legislation. For example, in California, there is a law that says that if you use a conversational agent, for example, for some purposes, for example, selling things to people or communicating some kind of information, it's written in the text of law. Well, you have to explicitly say this is a machine.
Yeah, transparency is important. I think we may differ a little bit about regulation. I agree that regulation may be necessary in the short term, but I think that if we rely on regulation in the long term, we're doing a disservice to the people who surround us. I think education is a more appropriate perspective to take. Education in the long run is going to bring what I would call the second aspect of empathy and ethics. So when I think of bringing together empathy and ethics, I think of two things. One is, do we build empathy into the systems, AI systems that we design? And the second is, do we have empathy for the people in the world who use those systems? So for me, the role of education is to help computer scientists, AI researchers, designers, all of those who have anything to do with bringing an AI system to market, such as a robot and a conversational agent. Education can help those stakeholders to understand the grand challenges of the day and to apply their own empathy such that they build machines that make the world better and not worse.
Well,
So idealistic, I know.
Sorry. Of course, I agree with the importance of education. This is central. Education to the engineers, education for the general public, education for the stakeholders, for the companies, leadership. Yes, of course, this is absolutely necessary. But I'm not so idealistic about the fact that education by on itself will be sufficient. I mean, we have a lot of examples where if you didn't have any regulation, things would go wrong, and actually they went. So education, yes, absolutely, 100%, but you need some regulation to make this education more operational, actually, in the real world, when it comes to building the systems and to comply with not only best practices, but also, well, regulation.
So I am definitely more idealistic than you are, but I also keep in mind that we're really at a crossroads in AI right now. Our abilities have made leaps and bounds in the last years, even in the last few months. The kinds of toolkits that are being released by the major international companies, multinational companies, allow us to do things we couldn't do even a year ago. And the crossroads is, what do we do with those tools? Of course, it's easy to build systems that rely on human biases and stereotypes to succeed. For example, there's been a lot of talk about conversational agents that play the role of a passive woman, a personal assistant who is female in looks and in voice and who acts submissive. This is relying on a stereotype. And if you look, for example, at Alexa and Siri across different countries, you can see that the companies who built those systems relied on what I see as quite dangerous stereotypes to build systems that would make them money. So at this crossroads, do we rely on societal stereotypes to make quick money, or do we push against those stereotypes? So my students and I have done work, for example, building conversational agents whose gender and ethnicity are ambiguous, so as to avoid exactly those kinds of stereotypes. Users love them. We've had very good feedback on them, and they push against stereotypes. So I think that too is what I mean by bringing education into the mix and bringing empathy for the grand challenges of the day.
Yes, well, again, I agree totally. But as you said, there is your work and there is Alexa. And there is your work and there is Sophia also.
Oof, yeah.
So, in other words, we need, of course, to push forward what you do and give this as a good example and educate people about it. But how do you prevent Sophia from being actually so much successful, if I may say so? That's the point. But I agree, on the long run, education will be clearly necessary and efficient to some point. So this is why I believe some regulation, especially if, for example, you deploy those systems in environments with vulnerable people, like elderly persons or children. And in this case, I believe that there have to be some limits that are put by, of course, again, education. But for example, the public, even educated, sometimes don't care, and that's the point. Even myself, I mean, I'm quite educated about those issues. Well, sometimes I accept that I'm tracked on my phone, right?
Faster, right?
So we need something to limit this.
Raja, I'm curious, because you've actually instituted education about ethics into computer science curricula. How has that worked?
Well, yes, thank you for this question. Indeed, for the past few years before I became emeritus, because now I can't teach again. I give conferences. I had a class with the engineering school in Sorbonne. So these engineers are engineers who work on robotics. It's the robotics track. And I had a class about ethics for robotics engineers, robotics and AI engineers. And the interesting experience that I can share very, very quickly is that if you come to those engineers and start speaking about ethics, they won't listen to you. Basically, they are interested in the technical aspects. They are not interested in philosophy. They are not interested in something that doesn't really address their issues. So you have to start with their issues, start with their projects, take concrete cases that they work on, and let them think by themselves, help them to think by themselves about the ethical issues that are involved. And then the good surprise, not so much a surprise actually, but the good surprise is that they become very indeed interested, and they want to understand the underlying issues, and this is where it starts.
You know, I'm glad you said that, because I was going to say that what we've said so far is pretty abstract and kind of philosophical. And I wonder whether we could take an example where we might not agree on this and see how we work it through. And I'm thinking of nurse spots, those systems that are evolving to take care of the elderly, for example. From my perspective, these systems can serve an important role, particularly in our society today, where for whatever reason, people are not willing to put money into human caregivers. And so old people find themselves alone, abandoned, not taken care of in EHPAD in France, in old age homes in the US and elsewhere. And for me, the role that nurse bots can serve there is to take care of the mundane tasks, leaving more time for the human caregivers to engage with their patients and to create social bonds. What do you think, Raja?
This will be the last intervention. So,
okay, thank you.
Conclusion word.
Very well, thank you.
No, Raja.
Yes.
I give you the
I'll
floor
be very
to answer.
fast about this. I think that doing this is okay, but it's actually enabling not to invest in hiring people, because it's falsely solve an issue. And empathy is not just listening, in my opinion. Again, it's also interacting with people about things they care about. So taking care of people, not just discussing with them, is also an issue in empathy.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Raja. Thank you, Justine, for this very nice discussion.
Thank you, Isabelle.
Thank you, Isabelle. Thank you, Justine.
We'll keep debating, Raja.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.